Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Yud Bet. Wishing everybody a Chodesh Tov. Really hoping for a better month than the previous. Okay, we're now going to get started with a review where we ended off last time. So we were in the last statement of Ula in the name of Rabbi Elazar, where he basically says that the halacha is you can collect a loan from slaves. I want to give some background. I think we might make it easier if we start with some basic laws about collecting loans. Let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth lends Naomi money. Naomi doesn't have the money to pay back, let's say. So Ruth can come and collect from really anything in Naomi's possession. Okay, that's what we saw last time, even from the shirt off her back, as we say. But if Naomi sells stuff to other people, then the only thing Ruth can collect from is land, because land is lien to the loan. Okay. But nothing else really, unless, and that was what we saw at the end of yesterday's daf, which was this apotiki. If Naomi said, when Ruth lent her the money, she said, listen, I'm not going to pay you back in cash. You're going to just collect, when the time for the loan comes up, you're going to collect it from this slave, from this shore, from this, whatever it might be. This is designated for the loan. So obviously, when Ruth goes to collect the loan, she's going to take that object. But what if it was sold to somebody else in the interim? So that's what we saw at the end of yesterday's daf. That depends. If it was a slave, and if we assume that people will know that this object was an apotiki, we'll know that if it's a slave. We won't know it if it's a shore, and obviously not if it's a beautiful bowl or crystal glass or whatever it might be. There's no things. It's not going to spread about this special glass vase that Naomi promised to Ruth. Okay, but if it's a slave, now again, slaves, I have to point out, especially if you're new to learning, if you're in Kiddushin, you know what we're talking about, because we're talking about Cannanite slaves that are considered the possession of the owner, not Jewish slaves. Jewish slaves are not owned by the master, but Cannanite slaves are, as hard as that is to fathom. But yes, there was this concept of slavery in those days, and they were owned by the master. So the other halacha you need to know, okay, those are some basic halachot that all of our sugya is premised on. The other thing you need to know is that if Naomi had this loan out with Ruth, and then Naomi were to die and left the loan to her children to pay back, then the only way that Ruth could collect money is from land that Naomi passed down to Ruth, to her children, sorry. Ruth cannot collect that loan from anything else, okay? Only land. And that's our big question. And anything that's considered like land. So are slaves considered like land or not? And we're going to see a big debate here today about whether, when we talk about land and all the things about land, so again, that means that if Naomi left no land to her children, then there's no way to collect a loan from her. Okay? So even if Naomi's children were to later buy land, it doesn't matter. Had to be land that Naomi passed on. So now Ula says, let's go back now to Ula. Okay, hopefully that background will be helpful for understanding all the ins and outs of this section. So Ula makes this statement in the name of Rabbi Elazar that Rabbi Elazar said you can collect from slaves. So now we have to understand what is the situation. Amalei Rav Nachman leUla, Amar Rabbi Elazar afilu miyatme. What do you mean? Was he saying that slaves are like land, in which case, if Naomi left slaves to her children and no land, that also Ruth could collect from those slaves? To which Ula said imagine somebody asked you a question like that. Do you mean that he said it even to Yatomim? So of course Ula's like, no, that's not what I meant. No way, no how. I want to remind you who Rav Nachman is. Rav Nachman was married to Yalta, who's the daughter of the Reish Galuta, and he was part of this aristocratic, wealthy, powerful people in the world. And Ula didn't really want to start up with him. So he says, oh no, of course I didn't mean that. Lo, mine, I was talking about that Ruth can go collect from slaves of Naomi. To which the Gemara asks, or maybe Rav Nachman asks, right? Mine, you mean from him? Well, then what was the point of saying this? Afilu miglima dal katve. Of course, Ruth could collect from Naomi's slaves. She could even collect from the shirt off her back. So it's not a big chiddush. It's not a unique halacha to say you could collect from slaves. That's why the Gemara says, oh, they must have been talking about okay, and then we have to say what Ula meant, what Rabbi Elazar meant was you can collect from slaves if you made them in a potiki, meaning you designated them for the loan, and you then sold them to somebody else. So if, let's say Naomi sells it to Yael, Ruth can go straight to Yael and take that slave, and she can't do that if it was a shore, if it was an ox. Okay, and that we already saw the difference because of the kol. I'm not going to read that again. Now the story continues in a very interesting way, starting from the top of our daf. That was how Ula responded to Rav Nachman, where Rav Nachman said, did you really mean from Yatomim also? To which she said, no way, no how. But after Rav Nachman left the Beit Midrash, Amar lahu Ula, Hachi Amar Rabbi Elazar, Afilu miyatmi. Now Ula tells the truth. He wasn't willing to say it in front of Rav Nachman, but when Rav Nachman left the Beit Midrash, he said, oh, by the way, Rabbi Elazar actually says you can collect from orphans. Meaning, basically, he's saying, Avadim, Canaanite slaves, are considered exactly like land. Okay, they have the same koach as land. So if Naomi left land to her children, then Ruth can collect. And if she left slaves to her children, then Ruth can collect from those slaves. Now, did he think Rav Nachman wasn't going to hear? He obviously did. But of course, there's spies in the Beit Midrash. Somebody told Rav Nachman this is what happened. Amar Rav Nachman ishtamitan Ula. He says, I can't believe Ula, basically, he must be scared of me. He didn't want to be honest with me. And he basically, lied to me. So Hava Uvda bin Nahardea. The story continues. There was a case in Nahardea where, just like the case of Ruth and Naomi dies, and now Ruth wants to collect from her children slaves. And the judges ruled, like Ula said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, that you could collect from orphans. Hava Uvda b'Pubedita, another case happened in Pubedita. The Rav Chana bar Bizna and Rav Chana bar Bizna ruled, like Rabbi Elazar, you can collect from the orphans, from the orphan slaves. Amar lahu Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman hears about this and he says, Zilu ahaduru. He goes to those creditors. Now, you can already imagine the scene. First of all, Rav Nachman is part of this aristocratic society. But what's interesting here is he sides on the orphan side. And he says, you wealthy people, you creditors, right? Usually the people who are lending the money are the wealthy in the high echelons of society. And he says to them, you can see that it's a critique on the way they're dealing with things. He says to them, Ahaduru, go give back those slaves to those poor orphans, right? First of all, we know the orphans are poor because they didn't have land. So anyone who doesn't have land is obviously or considered, especially in those days, if you weren't a landowner, you were considered to be more poor. And he says, go give them back those slaves you took. V'ilo, and if not, and here it's clear he's critiquing them because he says, Magbina lechula apandaichu. I'm going to collect it back. In other words, I'll collect the value of the slaves that you took in your palaces, meaning I'll give your palaces to those poor people. And he's saying the word apandaichu, which is palaces, to kind of stick it to them. You are living in this very wealthy place and you have a lot of money and you're bothering these poor orphans and you're taking things. And again, not lahalakha according to Rav Nachman. Now, obviously, they did it lahalakha according to Rabbi Elazar, but Rav Nachman disagrees and thinks you cannot collect from slaves. Now, Amar Rav Nachman. Rava comes to Rav Nachman and says, what are you getting involved here? Ha'ula, ha-Rabbi Elazar, ha-Dainei dinahardya, ha-Rav Chana bar Bizna. He lists him 4 people who all hold against him. And he's saying, leave it. The court ruled, based on these other opinions, why are you making such a big deal about this? And he says to him, Mar Kiman Svirale. He basically says, not only why are you making a big deal, but everybody else seems on the other side of you. Where do you get your opinion from that we're going to treat slaves like land? Amar le, Anam Anita Yadan. He said, I have a braita that supports my reading. Ditane Avimi. Avimi says, here's review of, we're going to have a lot of reviews today of Sugyot we've seen before. Prusbal. You remember we learned about Prusbal in Gittin? One of the laws of Prusbal is a way to override the fact that the Shemitah year cancels loans. And it was a big problem because people didn't want to lend money knowing they weren't going to get their money back. And then that in the end is detrimental to the poor people who won't get loans. So in order to resolve this problem, Hillel comes up with this Prusbal solution. But one of the criteria in order to be able to make Prusbal, which is basically saying that it's a document that's going to basically override, we're not going to go into all the details how it works, but it's going to override the Torah law that you have to, all the loans are canceled at the end of the Shemitah year. But it only works if the lova has land. One of the reasons is because if the borrower has land, then it's as if, since the land is already connected to the loan and lien to the loan, you could sort of say it's as if it was collected already. And that's why it doesn't get canceled, because it's as if it was collected. So you need to have land. So what it says in this Braita is, Prusbal chala lakarka ve'eno chala lavadin. It only works if you have land. It doesn't work if you have no land, but you have slaves. So what do you see here? Slaves are not like land. And the second halacha in this Braita, mitaltalim niknim im akarka ve'enam niknim im avadim. This is what we call a kinyan agav. Kinyan agav, we learned also in Kiddushin, which is, if I'm buying land from you, and I'm also buying movable property, normally we make a deal. I say I'm buying this, but it's not a deal until we do some sort of kinyan, act of acquiring. Well, I don't have to do an act of acquiring also on the land, also on the movables. I can just do an act of acquiring on the land. And with that, the metaltalin, the movable property, is already as if I acquired it. Normally you have to do mishicha, you have to pull it, or you could do mesira, passing it over. The ideal is to do mishicha, pulling it. I don't have to pull all the metaltalin in this case, because all of them can be acquired, and we're going to talk about this a lot more today, through the kinyan on the land. Now, what does it say here? Mital, the movable property, is niknim im akarka, can be acquired through karka, in this kinyan agav we call it. Ve'enam niknim im avadim. But if you acquire avadim and you do a kinyan on them, and at the same time you're doing this deal that also involves metaltalin, you can't say, oh, now that I've acquired the slave, all the metaltalin are also mine. No, you have to do a separate act of acquiring on the other objects. So here comes Rav Nachman with his proof. I have tannaitic source that shows, like me, that we don't treat slaves like land. Now the Gemara is going to say, lema ketanai. Perhaps this is a machloket between two tannaitic sources. Okay, maybe whether we treat slaves as land or we treat it as movables is a machloket between tannaim. And now I'm going to pull up the study guide, and we're going to see it inside. So we now have this Braita, and I want to show it in the chart because there's only one line in the there's going to be basically three basic cases, which each split into two, and it's going to be the first part of the third one that's going to be relevant to, that we're going to bring a contradiction, and we're going to resolve the contradiction by saying, oh, this Braita must hold one way, and this Braita must hold the other way. So let's see that inside. Macharlo, what we're basically talking in this Braita is about a kinyan agav that we just discussed. Macharlo avadim v'karkaot. If somebody sells, Ruth sells to Naomi slaves and land. If he acquires the avadim, the slaves, he doesn't acquire the land through there. If he does a chazaka on the evet, doesn't work as an act of acquiring or a kinyan on the evet. He does some sort of act of acquiring. It doesn't work for the land. The land is not acquired to him yet. And likewise the reverse. You can't acquire slaves through a kinyan agav of land. Karkaot u'metaltalin. If you take karka and movables, this is the classic kinyan agav. If you acquire the karka, the land, you acquire all the movables. But if it's metaltalin, lo kana karka. But if you acquire the movables, you definitely don't acquire the land. Okay, you need the acquiring of the land to enable the metaltalin. Avadim u'metaltalin. If you're acquiring slaves and movables, this is going to be the key. You do a kinyan on the slave, you don't acquire the metaltalin. This seems to say because avadim are not like land, right? If they were like land, it would work. B'metaltalin lo kana avadim. If you acquire movables, you also don't acquire the slaves with it. Okay. V'hatanya. Now here's a different bright. On that last case of someone who sells slaves and movables, it says if you acquire the eved, you do an act of acquiring on the slave, and the agreement was about the slave and all sorts of movable property, the metaltalin become yours. Okay, so that seems to say, right? Is it not that this is a machloket between the two braitot? Okay, the first braita says avadim are like movables, and that's why kinyan agav doesn't work with slaves. And the second one says avadim are kumakarke, they're like land, and that's why it does work. Basically, fill in instead of eved, it works just like karka, right? Instead of land, use eved, and it works to acquire the metaltalin. So it seems to be and then the Gemara says, look, whether you hold like Rav Nachman or you hold like Rabbi Elazar and all the others who held like him, is a debate among Tanaim as well. It's not just the amoraim debate this issue, it's also Tanaim. However, we're now going to suggest two other readings, both in the name of Rav Ika Bered Rav Ami. It's just going to be a debate about which one he actually said. That really it's not a machloket between, it's not that these two disagree about that issue. They either both agree that it's like land, and then we're going to have to explain why Kinyan Agav doesn't work in one of the cases, right, for Evet, or the opposite, that it's like metaltali and it is like movables, and then we're going to have to explain then why does it work in the other case, okay? So that's going to be our next section. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ika Bered Rav Ami, de kule alma avadim kimakarke dami. So suggestion number 2, really, right? The first suggestion was this is a debate among Tanaim. Now he's going to say, now you could say everybody agrees that slaves actually are just like land in all sorts of situations, like, for example, the Prus ball and, other things. But haditanya kana shapir. So first of all, so the one who says hechzik ba'avadim kana metaltalin, if you acquire the eved, you also can acquire the movables, obviously holds the simple. That's easy. Shapir means it works beautifully. Avadim kimakarke dami, very simply. But right, v'haditanya lo kana, the one who says though you can't do a kinyan agav with slaves and movables, why not? Well, kinyan agav has a unique criteria. In other words, in general, you could say slaves are like land, but kinyan agav is different. Why is that? We'll see in a minute. Be'inan karka dumia ta'arim mitzurot b'Yehuda de lo nandi. You need land like fortified cities in Judea. What is unique about fortified cities in Judea? They don't move. What is different about a slave? A slave moves. It's not right in one place. Ditnan, how do we know? Now, what's the connection? Why on earth would you need it? Why does it have to be like fortified cities in Yehuda? Well, that's because the whole halacha of Kinyan Agav was learned from a verse that talked about fortified cities in Yehuda in Divrei Yamin. So how are we going to see this? Ditnan, we're going to quote a Mishna that we learned in Masechet Kiddushin. Nechasim she'en lahem achrayut niknim im nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut. Okay, ein lahem achrayut means they're not lienable, which means, right, there's no lien on them, which means movables. Yesh lahem achrayut is land. So this just means nechasim she'en lahem achrayut, which is metaltalin, movables, are niknim, are acquired with nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut, with land. In what way? Well, all the ways that land can be acquired. Bekesef, if you pay money for land, as soon as you pay the money, the land is yours. If you didn't pay the money, but you wrote a shtar and you signed the shtar, the land is yours. If I write a shtar, a document. Or the chazaka, if you didn't pass any money, you didn't write a shtar, but you started working the land that we had a deal about, that we discussed, then already you acquire the land. And if in part of the discussion, we did in the arrangement, we discussed all sorts of other things, then basically you're also acquiring all those metaltalin. That's the way Kinyan Agav works. That's what the Mishnah says. Minna hanemile, where do we get this from? Amar Chizkiah Amar Kra, he says that because the pasuk says, "V'yitain lahem avihem matanot rabot." He got a lot. The father gave the son a lot of gifts. Lekesef, lezahav, ve'lemigdanot im arei mitzurot b'Yehuda. So they were granted all these gifts, movable items, with cities, fortified cities in Judea. So now we see that's the whole source for Kinyan Agav. Because this is the source for Kinyan Agav, what do we see? That Kinyan Agav has to be, it's only going to work, meaning in general, we could say Avadim are like land, but not for the issue of a Kinyan Agav. Okay? So what would it work for? Exactly our issue that Rav Nachman and Ula were debating. It would work if the Yatomim, if the orphans were inherited slaves only, well, then the master could, the creditor could seize those slaves because it is like land, just not for Kinyan Agav, because Kinyan Agav has unique criteria. That's one possible way to resolve the contradiction between the two Braitot without assuming, oh, it's a debate, a tannaitic debate. Is it like karka? Is it like metaltalin? No, could be they all think it's like karka. There's a unique halakha. Now we're going to do the reverse. We're going to say Ika Damre. Some people say that we're Rav Ika. Rav Ika. Bered Rav Idi said was actually something different. So Ika Damre, Amar Rav Ika, Bered Rav Idi. Actually, I see here it was Bered Rav Ami. Here it's Bered Rav Idi. There's a little note there. I didn't look at it, but maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's a different Rav Ika. Okay, but either which way, it's a different version. Dekule alma avde kimitaltalin dami. Really, everybody holds that slaves are like movables. And now we're going to have to explain it the reverse. So the first braita, Detanya lo kana, which says kinyan agav doesn't work, shapir, is very simple. It doesn't work because it's movable. Ha Detanya kana, well, how's the kana going to work? If we say it's like movables, then how can you possibly acquire movables together with slaves? If you do the acquiring of the slaves, it shouldn't work. Well, ba'odan alav. What we mean is you acquire a slave, and the slave is wearing clothes. And basically, since you acquired the slave, and the slave has clothes that he's wearing, well, you acquire whatever the slave is wearing. It's not a kinyan agav, it's something else. It's just when you acquire a slave, you get whatever goes along with him, his clothes as well. That sounds good, but the Gemara is going to have a big question on that, which is, and this is going to remind us of some sugyot we've seen in the past also. Wait a minute. How does this work? This is what we call a kinyan chatzer, not a kinyan agav. Kinyan agav works that we can have a deal about, I'm buying a house, and with it, I'm buying some desks that you have somewhere else, okay, not in the house. And when I acquire the house, I can already get those, meaning those desks are considered in my possession already, even though they weren't in the house at the time. That's a kinyan agav. But a regular kinyan chatzer is if I acquire your chatzer and in it there's items, like I acquire your house and we had agreed that I was buying all the furniture in the house. All I need to do is a kinyan on the house and the furniture is automatically mine, not because of agav. It works even simpler. It's because of the kinyan chatzer. If you let me give me rights to your courtyard, obviously whatever's in it is going to be mine as well. You would have taken out whatever you didn't want. And also assuming we agreed to it, right? If you tell me you're acquiring my house, but I'm taking all my furniture out, that's a different story. But if you didn't say that, then the assumption is it includes everything in it. So now, with this count, now we assume then the eved is what we call a kinyan chatzer. Since I acquired the eved, I acquire whatever is on him. But it only works a kinyan chatzer if the chatzer is like a real chatzer or courtyard, which is it doesn't move. But this is a chatzer mahalecheti. This slave is a walking chatzer. Why should that matter? Well, chatzer mahalechet lo kana. The rule is that if it's a moving chatzer, okay, which would be a person, an animal, right, then I don't acquire what's on it. So that wouldn't be a good resolution to the contradiction, okay, to say that, oh, really, it's like metaltalin, but this works because of a kinyan chatzer. How could you possibly have a kinyan chatzer with an eved? You might remember the answer because we're going to get there in a minute. We're now going to suggest two possible answers. The first one we're going to reject. Well, maybe, right? Chatzer mahalechet is a problem, but if you acquire the eved while the eved is standing in place, he's stationary at that point, maybe it will work. But that can't work because the ha'amarava, kol she'ilu mahalech lo kana, or maybe yashev lo kana. If you're sitting or standing and staying in one place, if potentially you could be walking and moving, but you happen not to be, that's still called a chatzer mahalechet. Chatzer mahalechet is you're potentially able to walk, even though you might not be walking at the moment. So that doesn't work. But the second option is the hilchata bikafut. And this we've learned before. It's a very strange thing. It's hard to fathom you would do this. It's hard to fathom in general. They're slaves. And then you would tie up your slave, right? The slave was tied down to something, so the slave couldn't move. In that case, if you acquire the slave, you would acquire the clothes that are on the slave because, and then you basically say that braita, which is very hard to say. It's what we call an ukimta, and a very unique ukimta, that it only works kanam avadim, kanam metaltalin, right? If you acquire both at once and the eved was wearing clothes, it would have to be number one on him, and he would have to be tied down to somewhere where he couldn't move. Then, since potentially he can't move right now because he's tied down, that would be enough to call him a chatzer. And then it would work because it's a chatzer, but not a kinyan agav, in which case, again, let's just look at our chart again to see. What we did was, right, after we had this whole debate between Ula, Rabbi Elazar, and Pumbedita rabbis, Chana Bar Bizna on one side, Rav Nachman on the other side, Rav Nachman then brought a tannaitic source to prove his point. Now we tried to say maybe there's a tannaitic debate about this, and we bring two different braitas about kinyan agav and whether it works for avadim, it doesn't work for avadim, and then we thought this is a tannaitic debate. We then said first answer is it is like land according to everybody. Just one opinion holds that in order for you to do a kinyan agav, it has to be exactly like the verse that where we learned it from. It would have to be non-moving. The second is to say that everyone holds as metaltalin, But the reason it works is not a kinyan agav, according to that Braita. It's because the clothes were actually on him. And then we had to explain the only way this would work as a kinyan chatzer is if the animal was the slave was actually tied down. Okay, that was what we got up to now. But you might have noticed this when I read it, and I specifically glossed over it because I didn't want to get distracted. But now we have to go back to some other line in that Braita. The first Braita said in the first line, if you sell slaves and land, if you acquire the slaves, you don't acquire the land, okay? But here's the important. You acquire the land, you don't acquire the slaves, okay? Now, I'm sorry. The line we want is the slaves, you don't acquire the land. If you acquire the slaves, you can't acquire land, okay, through that. So now we're going to say, no. Sorry, it was the second line. Bekarkaot, if you acquire the land, you don't acquire slaves. Now, by the way, if we view slaves as metaltalin, as movables, then it should work, right? And so, if you remember in the beginning, we said avadim are like metaltalin according to the first one. Well, they're not exactly like metaltalin because if they really were like metaltalin, if you acquired land, you should have been able to acquire the slaves with that, like a regular kinyan aga. So the Gemara could have asked that, but instead the Gemara asked it in a different way, which is by bringing a different braita that contradicts. So now we're up to a third braita. Okay, we started with these two braitot, one which was very long and one which only, we only brought one line of at least. Now we're going to talk about a third braita. V'hatanya, hichzik bekarka kana avadim. If you acquire land, you do acquire the avadim, okay? And that contradicts the first line in our braita, which said, karkaot, you don't acquire the slaves with it, right? Kinyan agav doesn't work. To which they answer, in order to resolve this contradiction, be'omdim betocha. Now remember what I told you. If you do a kinyan agav, you can acquire things that are somewhere else, right? So now we're going to say no. You can't acquire avadim in a kinyan agav, but you can if they're standing in the property. Okay, like we said before, more like a kinyan chatzer type thing. If there's an eved in the land and you acquire the land, then you can acquire the slave. And therefore, there's no contradiction between the two because when it said in the first braita, karka, you don't acquire slaves, that was in a case where the slaves weren't standing in the property. But if the slaves are standing in the property, it works. Okay, now we have to go back to the two versions of Rav Ika and see, does this answer make sense according to the two versions? Okay, so let's go now into the sugya. Michlal, so from here, what do you infer? The fact that you have to be standing, the eved has to be standing, the slave is standing in the property for this to work, you can infer that what? Hai lo kana k'she'enum din b'tocha, right? That's very clear. If he's not standing in the property, then you're not going to acquire the eved with the land. Well, now remember, Rav Ika, according to the first version, held that avadim are like land. According to the second version, he held they're like movables. So now let's plug them in and see which one works better. If you hold that they're like metaltalin, then it makes sense. Now, this isn't exactly true, but right now let's just go with it. If you're going to say slaves are like metaltalin, then you can say that's why they can be acquired. And you just need this criteria that they have to be standing inside. Okay, but if they're not standing inside, then it won't work. And that's what you would have to say. But it can work if they're standing inside because they're metaltalin. But according to the version that said, the first one, the Amar, but if you say that slaves are like land, how does it help that they're standing? Why do you need? This is interesting. This is something new that we didn't see yet, which we did see in Kiddushin, so you might remember it. But you don't even need to be standing in the property for it to work. Land can be acquired with land. Okay, now this is why it's not exactly true what I said before. Karka, right? Lo kanavadim doesn't, okay, well, actually it is true. Karka lo kanavadim, if you say it's metaltalin, you could say why it doesn't, right? It doesn't acquire. But, and then we'd say, okay, if the slave is inside, yes. If the slave is not inside the property, no, because it doesn't really work. But now we're going to say, if you say it's like land, why do you need to be standing there? Hamar Shmuel, don't you remember Shmuel said this? You might remember this case. If we had a deal, okay, that I was buying 10 fields from you in 10 different countries, all of the land is considered one and the same. So now, according to this, it shouldn't, if all land is considered one and the same, and kark and avadim equals land, then theoretically, chzik bekarka kana avadim, even if the slave is not standing inside. So basically, if we resolve the contradiction by saying we differentiate between if the slave is the inside or the slave is not inside, doesn't make any sense. In order to answer this question, they're going to throw a question back on what we thought was obviously true, which is not obviously true. Okay, now remember, if you say they're metaltalim, we thought it was obvious, that's why you need to be standing inside. But I already taught you, right? We just discussed that if I buy a desk from you and I'm buying your land, the desk could be not in the property and it works. And that was a whole sugya we saw in Kiddushin. It was called, do you need svurin or not? Do you need them to be all in one place do you need them to be collected and in the field or not? And in the end, we concluded this was a very long sugya that you don't need svurin. So now they're going to say, you're asking why it doesn't work if they're not inside, if we view it as land. But I'm going to say it's the same question. Why did you need them to be inside the property if you view them as movables? According to what you're saying, this question, also, if you say it's metaltalin, it doesn't need to be in the property. Moving now to Amubet, we already learned from that sugya in Kiddushin, they don't need to be in the land. The desk could be outside. The slave could be not in the property. So now it doesn't work according to either reading. But because it doesn't work according to either reading, we're going to have to now, and it's very interesting, the sugya ends with this very important distinction. Until now, we've been saying either we view slaves like metaltalin or we view them like land. Now we're going to show that even if we view them like metaltalin, movables, there's a difference. And even if we view them like land, there's a difference. And that's what's going to cause the difference here, why the slave has to be standing for it to work, which resolve that contradiction. Either the slave is standing and then it would work, or the slave is not standing and it wouldn't work. And we're going to read it according to both readings, whether you view it as movables or whether you view it as land. We already learned, just to review, if you say kinyan agav works and you say that slaves are like movables, right? Movables, it should work even if it's outside. You acquire the land, you acquire the movables that are not even on the property. If you say it's like land, that basically you have land being acquired with land, and we also said that it doesn't need to be in the same place. You could have 10 different properties in 10 different countries, and I could acquire one, and I acquire all of them. So either which way, it doesn't need to be standing. But now we're going to say, no, slave is different from this, and slave is different from that, and that's why it requires it to be standing inside the property. By the way, it doesn't have to be standing. It could be sitting, just found in the property. So, elamai lachlamemer, how can you resolve this? Shane metaltale denaide me metaltale de lo naide. What's the big difference? And we're going to use this difference for both. What's the big difference between movables and slaves? Well, most movables don't move. Okay, even though they're called movables, they get moved by people, right? We pick them up. But most of them don't move on their own. So now, anything that moves on its own, you could see why it would have to be in the property. Because if it has a mind of its own and can wander, right, whether it's an animal and can wander or it's a person and can wander, it's going to be different. And therefore, metaltale denaide are not the same as metaltale de lo naide, which means if you're going to acquire and say it's like metaltalin and you can do a kinyan agav, it's only going to work though, even though the desk could be outside the property, but if it's a slave, the slave's going to have to be in the property. Hachanami, we're going to say the same thing when it comes to the land. Here they're going to have a bit of a different twist though, which we already saw in Kiddushin, you'll probably remember because it was interesting. Shani mekarke denaide mekarke de lo naide. Movable land is different than land that doesn't move, right? Most land doesn't move, but here we're going to say avadim are like land, but yet they move. Right? Land, slaves are considered like land that moves. Now, why is it different? Hatam, in the case of the 10 properties in 10 different countries, Sadna da'ara chadhu, they had this vision that every piece of land that's on planet Earth is basically connected one to the other. It's like one big, right? Like the way we say we're all related in the end, right? So all of the land is connected somehow. So therefore, if I acquire one, I could acquire the other. But you can't say that all people standing on Earth are connected to Earth, right? They're all like one thing. No, it's not. So the reason I can acquire one field and then with that I can acquire 10 others is because the land is viewed as one continuum, even if they're not right next to each other. But you can't say the same thing with land and slaves. Okay, so that's why in both cases, either which way you look at it, whether you view them as land or you view them as movables, Either which way, they're different from land and they're different from the typical movables. Okay, so now I see you're asking about animals. The same kind of discussion, I don't remember now all the details about animals, but animals also seem to have this deliberation, like where exactly do we put them? I remember that there's issues about animals also being a little bit unclear where exactly they fall. I don't remember the exact same sugi here, but there are some questions about animals, where exactly the animals fall in this continuum of movables and land. But again, in a certain way, certainly we saw at the end of yesterday's daf that there's no call about them. We don't have these, everybody knows, like they know about land and like they know about slaves. So it is a little different, right? If you're talking about a scale, it's definitely closer to movables than the slaves are, although they do have that element, obviously, that they move on their own. Okay, now we have, and yes, there's also a difference that we talked about. Thank you, Becky, that slaves have their own unique mind about them, whereas animals don't, even though they might, run away, but they don't have the same knowledge and ability to think, which also has differences. There's all sorts of differences that come up. So review of our sugya. Let's just do a review, and we'll use the study guide as our basis. We're going to just do another little thing. Okay. So now we had started with this halacha of Ula in the name of Rabbi Elazar. We had the debate between him and Rav Nachman. We had the whole thing that he hid it from Rav Nachman. He was scared of him. He didn't want to say anything. And then we said maybe it's tannaitic debate. We rejected that. Rav Ika, we had two versions of it. Then we brought this braita, another part of the braita that contradicted a third braita. And then we said, he must be standing, in which case we said that doesn't work according to really either version of Rav Ika. And then we explained, well, it's different, okay? And different than metaltalin and different than land. Even if we do say we treat it that way, but it's going to be different in certain ways. Okay, now we go to the next part of our sugya. The next part of our sugya is the next line in the Mishna. And the Mishna said, you pay damages if it's property that doesn't have meila associated with it. Now, the way we explained it when we got to the Mishna was that just means not sanctified objects. So if it's sanctified, remember we learned shor re'ehu, it's only if your shor damages another shor, your friend's shor, not one that belongs to the temple. But it didn't say that. It said nechasim that don't have meila. What is meila? Meila is, there's a law. If you misuse consecrated property, you're liable for meila. This whole law, what you have to do. Anyway, they say here, me'ilahu deleipahu ha mikdash kanshe. Well, there are things that are sanctified that don't have meila. And then they would fall into the category of this Mishnah. For example, kodshim kalim. Okay. And basically what they're going to say is the fact that they use this language, she'ein b'hem meila, they must be saying, but yes, if it's kodshim kalim, for example, if I want to bring a korban shlamim, I designate an animal, I sacrifice it, and then I eat the animal. That's all called kodshim kalim because I eat almost everything. Just certain parts get burnt on the altar. The rest of it I eat. Now, this implies that basically, since I get to eat the meat, this animal is mine. If the animal is mine, well, then if you damage my animal, let's say before I sacrifice it, it's still alive, you come and damage my animal, well, you have to pay me because it's still mine. Well, this would only be Montana, according, which Tana does this accord with? Rabbi Yochanan, the kodshim kalim baliba to Rabbi Yosi. Basically, Rabbi Yochanan says our Mishnah is clearly excluding something. It's saying only, right? It's saying only kodshim are not going to have damages associated with them, but if it's kodshim kalim, it will be. And the Mishnah must hold like Rabbi Yosi Aglili. How do we know? Titanya. Umala mal bashem. This is a pasuk about person who sins and claims they don't owe money, and it turns out they lied, okay? And they lied about something. They have to do, it's called the shvuat pikadon, right? They took an oath that was a false oath. They have to bring a korban chatat. Now, it says in that pasuk a few words that don't really make sense. Umala mal bashem. It's not really against God. It says b'chichesh b'amito, and he denied something to a fellow friend. Why does it say mala mal bashem? And meila, right, usually is associated with the temple. So what does Rabbi Yosi Aglili learn from here? He says this could be an issue that you have a debate with a friend. Let's say your friend asked you to watch the shore, their ox, that they had already designated for a sacrifice, and you claimed something happened to it and it wasn't true. The ox was still in your possession. Well, even though some might say that's hekdesh, sanctified, so you wouldn't be an issue because not chichesh b'amito. Well, Malama Bashem comes to say, no, there's some things that are sanctified that you'd still have to, this law would be applicable to you because kodshim kalim are considered yours. Divrei Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Okay, that's Rabbi Yosi Aglili's position, and that must be what our Mishnah matches. To which the Gemara asks the question, 1 minute. Hadran, hamikadesh b'chalko, bein b'kodshim kodshim, bein b'kodshim kalim, ena mikudeshet. If you, a Kohen, takes his portion, whether it's from the kodshim kodshim or from the kodshim kalim, and betroths a woman with her, she's not mikudeshet, which means even if it's kodshim kalim, it's not considered the possession of the Kohen. Okay, so lema deloka Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Are you going to say that's not like Rabbi Yosi Aglili, that braita? To which the Gemara says, no, we actually can explain in 2 ways. Either you say that's the other opinion, or you could say afilu tema Rabbi Yosi Aglili ki amar Rabbi Yosi Aglili michayim aval achar shchita afilu Rabbi Yosi Aglili modeh. You could say, and I'll pull up the study guide again. You'll see it in the chart. You could say that Mishnah. It's not that it holds like against Rabbi Yosi Aglili, and there's another opinion here. You could say that Mishnah, that she's not betrothed, is after you slaughter it. In other words, Rabbi Yosi Aglili says it's considered yours when you designate the animal from the beginning. Because you're going to end up eating it, it's yours. However, once you bring it to the temple and you sacrifice it, and once you basically slaughter it, and then the meat becomes permitted to you, he says the following. Once you bring it to the temple, it belongs to God. What's the issue? Why are you allowed to eat the meat? Because God allows you to eat the meat, okay? But it's God's at this point. So basically, according to what we're saying now, which we're going to question in a minute, but according to what we're saying now, Rabbi Yosi Aglili thinks that if you have this timeline, when you separate the animal and sanctify it to the temple, if it's going to be a korban shlamim, which you're going to end up eating, it's actually considered yours still. So if someone damages it, right, they have to pay. Once it is sacrificed, slaughtered, and then sacrificed, then the meat becomes God's meat. You're allowed to eat it, but you're allowed to eat God's meat. Then it's no longer, right, your own. So now the Gemara wants to ask a big question. So now they say, Umechayim mi amar. Now we're going to have a long question that's going to be till the end of the daf. It's going to be several sections, and that's why also I charted it out so you could see. Okay, we're going to now say the following. First stage is to bring a Mishnah, then we're going to limit the Mishnah, and then we're going to bring a contradiction here, and then we're going to resolve the contradiction. Ravina is going to resolve it, and then we're going to basically say, from the fact that he didn't resolve it in the following way, could teach us that maybe Rabbi Yosi Aglili doesn't think that when the animal's alive, it's considered your own. Okay, that's going to be the big question. So again, it's a long-winded argument here. Okay, a Mishnah about a Bechor. Bechor seems to be right now, we're assuming it's the same thing as kodshim kalim as a shlamim. It basically is the firstborn animal goes to the Kohen and the Kohen has to slaughter it. Okay, if it gets a blemish, then the Kohen can redeem it and it's his. But until then, right, if it's a tam, meaning a complete animal, it's not blemished, you have to sacrifice it in the temple and then you can eat the meat like the shlamim. So it's basically like the Kohen's property. And in fact, it says here, Bechor, muchrim oto tam chai, so if it's a tam, it has no blemish, you can sell it if you want to another Kohen, okay? You can sell it probably just to another Kohen, maybe not even. It's a good question. But, right. So we're going to say it means nowadays, and right, they sell it to a Kohen. Balmum, if it's blemished, you could sell it whether it's alive or whether it's slaughtered, because once it's a blemished, you're allowed to slaughter it yourself. And it's yours to the extent that you can even betroth a woman with it. Okay, that seems pretty clear, like Rabbi Yosi Aglili, that it's yours, even when it's alive, right? Tam chai and balmum chai. But now, we're going to focus more on this line about tam chai, okay? That it's a complete animal, it's not blemished, it's supposed to be offered as a sacrifice, and you can sell it if you want to another Kohen. But Rav Nachman, Rav Ravua, we meet Rav Nachman again. He quotes Rav Ravua as saying, Lo shanu ela bechor b'zman hazeh. Oh, wait a minute. This bechor is only yours if nowadays. It's because nowadays you can't sacrifice it. There is no temple. But if the temple is around and you can sacrifice it on the altar, no way, no how can you sell it. No way, no how can you give it to a betrothed woman with it. It's not yours to be selling. Now, Rava brought this question to Rav Nachman and said, wait a minute, here's the chart. He says, but that contradicts Rabbi Yosi Aglili said the kodshim kalim are yours. If they're yours, you should be able to sell them. You should be able to betroth a woman even if the temple is around, because right, that seems like a reasonable contradiction. Now, at this point, Ravina answers Mishani Ravina, when Rabbi Yosi Aglili said what he said, he was talking about, not like we understood before, he's talking about a bechor outside of Israel in the time of the temple. Now, the Mishnah was not the time of the temple. In the time of the temple, when is it yours? Not if you're living in Jerusalem or in Israel. If you're living outside of Israel, and you would have to say it's only according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says that if you live outside of Israel and you bring your bechor into Israel, you're a kohen, and you bring your bechor into Israel and it can be sacrificed, you have to sacrifice it. Which implies, though, only if you came. But you don't have an obligation to bring your bechor from outside of Israel to Israel to sacrifice. You can actually eat it outside, right? It can be your own property. Now, that's what Rabbi Yosi Aglili was talking about. Now, here comes the question. Now, we're obviously talking about a live animal here because the whole Mishnah was bechor mechrim oto tam chai, when it's alive. And now we basically have decided, the way Ravina resolved it, is that nobody thinks when it's alive that you can actually sell it and it's your own. So if Rabbi Yosi Aglili really thought mamonohu mechayim, that it is your property when it's alive, lishane ha Rabbi Yosi Aglili ha Rabbanan, there would have been a much easier resolution to the contradiction. You would have just said, bechor mechrim oto tam chai, that's only when it's not the time of the temple. In the time of the temple, you can't do it. That's the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yosi Aglili. And Rabbi Yosi Aglili, who says, right, kodshim kalim are your possession, that would be tam chai, right? And it would be the same case. It's just a different position, Rabbi Yosi Aglili. So by the fact that he has to go, like we say, over or backwards by saying, oh, it's a bechor outside of Israel, and it's only according to Rabbi Shimon, to explain the bright of Rabbi Yosi Aglili must mean that he thinks that Rabbi Yosi Aglili didn't think that when it's alive, it's actually your own. That's our question, and we will resolve it tomorrow in tomorrow's daf. It's a very simple resolution, but we're done for today, so we'll stop here. I'll leave you hanging how we resolve this problem. Okay, so end of the daf, what we did was we said this source, our Mishnah, called Nechasim She'en B'hem Meila, seems to say, but not kodshim kalim, right? Kodshim kalim would be included with regular things, and that's because it holds like Rabbi Yosi Aglili. And then we tried to figure out what exactly is Rabbi Yosi Aglili's position. At what point does he think that it's your own, and at what point does he think, right? We ended up saying he thinks it's your own in the early stage, but he doesn't think it's your own after you slaughter it. Then you can eat it, but you can only eat it because you're eating from God, but it's not really yours. And then we basically questioned that from the bechor case and said, there it seems like Rabbi Yosi Aglili, again, from Ravina's resolution to the contradiction, it sounds like Rabbi Yosi Aglili doesn't think it's your own when it's alive. Doesn't think so. So we're going to have to resolve that, only if, right, you're outside of Israel, but not if you're inside Israel, and only if you're held by Rabbi Shimon, right? But that he doesn't think that a regular in the time of the temple in Israel would be able to be considered your own, that you could betroth the woman with it or do whatever you want with it. So we're going to have to resolve that. In the end, we'll distinguish between bechor and other cases. That's going to be the gist of our resolution. But that was the question, and we will end with that. Wishing everybody a chodesh tov.